Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ102, Introduction to Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice Online. And tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 14, Corrections. And I wanted to start pretty quick here with a video. And I'm hoping that the video doesn't take too long, but I think it's a part that we need to see as we talk about corrections, specifically in today's society, and how law enforcement is actually dealing with corrections. So with that being said, don't forget the key terms, those resources at the beginning of your chapter, the discussion questions, of course, at the end of your chapter, and we'll kind of just jump right in. So here are the learning objectives that I'm going to have you read through, so you can kind of look at those at your leisure and decide after you've read the chapter, because I know you all read it because you guys are awesome, and look at some of the videos and what have you. You can go back and kind of compare what you've learned and see if you have learned any of these things that are listed. And I want to start with this video if I can get it to play before we jump in.
The Rialto Rancher Support Team was started in December of 2013 as a response to the early release of prisoners coming out because of Assembly Bill 109. Thousands of state prison inmates are headed here. Many people have described this as one of the biggest change in public safety in California in decades.
We're now under a court order to release thousands of people to meet an arbitrary capacity figure.
Ready or not, here it comes. Our focus is people on probation, parole, post-release community supervision, and also people who are on that pre-offender status, people who just kind of need some help, whether it's counseling services or working workforce development to get a job, to help people get back on track.
I found out your date for discharge. Shouldn't have nothing between now and August 15th. No negative police contact, no arrest. You will be discharged on the 15th. That's good news. I'm glad.
I came to the program. I just recently got out of prison, so I'm hoping just to better myself, man. Try to get a job to provide for my family. Stuff that I missed back in the day. Growing up. Now I got an opportunity to do it.
We offer hope to individuals. A lot of times they're not really accepted by society, employers. We talk to them about making good choices. Talk to them about teach them actually how to answer the interview question, and on the application how to answer that conviction question.
It's a stage. Once you get into that office, it's a stage. He's acting, you're acting. You're selling. Who are you selling? What are you selling? You. You're both together going for the same job. You both have a dime, same year, but one of you has to convince me that your dime is better.
That's super. Why should I hire you? I have a lot of experience in warehouse. In the past, I have made some mistakes. Used to make stuff, 10 years of stuff. You go into your skills, and then your personal traits.
Warehouse, loading and unloading, counting.
It's not something to be concerned about because I have had nothing as far as even traffic violations. We have a guy on our caseload right now. Gang member. He's got tattoos as well. We just got a job with Lawland Fire and $18 an hour. Something told me, try something new. I didn't have any money. I was so struggling, so finally I did. So I started going over there. I started seeing my for change, something like that, to work the bus. I started doing little interviews. I got this call on the phone saying that they had a job for me. And it was a firefighter. And it started at 1850. So I was shocked, because I was like, I'm a felon now. Do they accept that like me? And yeah, they did. So the only way these programs are going to succeed is if through word of mouth. By you going out and telling them. I mean, I tell my homie that they're happy. Yeah, because when they see you get a job and you succeed, then they're gonna say, hey, you know what, I can do this too. Been clean already for a year and a half already. And I got close to my family. I got my son back. One of the things that the Rialto Rancher Support Team does is we partner up with probation and we conduct compliance checks at the residence of people on probation and PRCS to make sure they're complying with their terms, they're not using drugs,
stay out of trouble, stay out of jail, not go back, they really need to have more. Yes, we want the society to be safe, but you have to think about employment. And it doesn't matter what type of crime the individual has, it doesn't matter if they have little work experience, where they find work, big chance they're not going to go back in.
Trying to get back out there, man, and just be productive in life and just leave my past behind.
It's really up to you if you want to change. You know, there's people out there willing to help you. You know, and it's no lie. There's people out there that help you. If I can establish enough trust in the community that they will take advantage of these services, overall, it's going to help families. It's going to help people coming out of prison make the right choices and stay away from these negative behaviors that got them into jail in the first place.
Okay, so I know that that took a couple of minutes for us to go through and to listen to, but I hope what you can see from that is the success rate that a lot of these programs might have. And we're going to talk later on a little bit about reentry programs and whether they work or what you even think about them. But let's kind of jump into our lecture today, and you'll see how the video kind of ties into what we're talking about. So prisons are the highest profile piece of corrections that portion of the criminal justice system charged with carrying out the sentences of our courts. And although prison is the image that first comes to mind for many people when they think about corrections, prisons actually hold less than 1/4 of those people under correctional supervision. Now, at year end in 2014, more than 6.8 million people, or 1 out of every 36 adults, were under the supervision of the U.S. correctional system. And roughly 2/3, or 68% of these offenders, were in some type of community supervision program. And the other 1/3, about 32%, were incarcerated. Now, this correctional population has trended steadily downward since peaking in 2007, with more than about 7.3 million people who were under correctional supervision in the United States. Now, corrections includes the vast network of programs, services, agencies, and institutions responsible for supervising individuals charged with or convicted of crimes. And since the 1960s, corrections has been greatly influenced by several environments, if you will. And in addition to the criminal justice system, of which this is a part of, and all these environments, you'll see a chart that's on page 571 that shows you the different environments that impact corrections, like the system and community and social and political and bureaucratic and legal and institutional, and how they all sort of surround corrections. And law enforcement officers' arrest decisions certainly directly affect who may end up in the correction system. So a little bit of a kind of an overview again. Throughout history, society has dealt with lawbreakers in many different ways, and has emphasized different goals and methods to accomplish these goals. And the pendulum has swung from seeking pure revenge, if you will, to viewing criminals as being ill and need of treatment. And it is swung from the very public punishment like floggings and hangings to solitary confinement. So when we talk about all of this, to the public, the term corrections is almost synonymous with punishment. And it wasn't until about 1954 that the American Prison Association changed its name to the American Correctional Association, reflecting a fundamental paradigm shift in the philosophy of handling those who break the law. Not only was punishment a valid objective, but so too were things like rehabilitation or correction, which thus the term corrections or correctional facility of persons found guilty of crime. So you can start to see the first paradigm shift or change from the way that we've always kind of done things. So throughout history, like I said, society has dealt with these lawbreakers in many, many ways, and we've seen this pendulum shift. And we know now that primary purpose of corrections include a lot of different things. So that primary purpose can be retribution, or deterrence, or incapacitation and rehabilitation. And all of these purposes, which often overlap, serve the primary goal of reducing recidivism, that revolving door, that in and out jail thing, or the return of an offender to criminal activity. So hopefully that kind of makes some sense to you. And we know that, again, that these primary purposes sometimes overlap, but let's take a closer look at what each of these means. So there are four primary purposes, and we can go back, and if you want a little bit more, you can look on page 571 that talks about the purpose and goals. But the primary purposes that we talked about would be retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. So what's retribution? Well, it's punishment for the sake of punishment, and maybe even revenge. Retribution, in essence, is punishment for the sake of punishment, and was most prevalent in ancient societies existing in such approaches as, just desserts, like you'll get your just desserts, not like the dessert you eat, but just desserts like you'll get yours. Or the term lex talionis, Talionis, which is from where? Come on, everybody. It's from the Code of Hammurabi. If you remember, kind of going way back to chapter 1, where it says, like, hey, an eye for an eye. And just desserts, you get what's coming to them. And so that's the essence, if you will, of retribution. And deterrence sees corrections as a way to prevent future criminal actions, a more functional, proactive view. It tries to make the consequences of committing crime so severe that when offenders return to society, that they maybe they won't reoffend. And deterrence that serves as an example to society of those consequences of crime is called general deterrence. Now, there's two types of deterrence, and we'll get more specific in a minute. But specific deterrence is aimed like right at the offenders. Attempts to make the consequences of committing crime so severe that when the offenders return to society, they won't commit crimes. Well, general deterrence, remember, sees corrections as a way to prevent future criminal actions and tries to show offenders that the price of committing crime is too great. And that's the essence of the two differences between deterrence. Incapacitation. That refers to making it impossible for offenders to commit further offenses. Incapacitation can take many forms, and one of the earliest forms was banishment, kind of like a social death. And some people believed at that time that this was the ultimate punishment, more devastating than being executed. And so incapacitation makes it impossible for offenders to commit further offenses. And some people think that let's just lock them all up And that would be the best way to do it. That's incapacitation. We're making it impossible for them to commit other crimes because their rear end is in prison or is in jail. And that's the essence of incapacitation. Well, what about rehabilitation? And again, a lot of terms to kind of go over. Rehabilitation sees the purpose of corrections to be clear from its name, to correct deviant behavior. It rests on the positivist theory, and we'll talk about this in a minute, who saw criminals as victims of society and their own biological, sociological, cultural, and physical environment. So rehabilitation basically means correcting deviant behavior. So these are the four primary purposes as we look at the purpose of correction. And another phrase that kind of comes to mind are the revolving doors of criminal justice, or this thing that they call recidivism, or even desistance, and we'll define these three things. So one of the primary goals of the correction system is to keep offenders from returning to criminal activity, whether through fear of future punishment, treatment of a condition that contributes to their criminality, or actual change in the way the offenders see their social responsibility and creation of a desire to lead a law-abiding life. And a person who has reached a permanent state of non-offending has achieved this term called desistance, which is the ultimate goal of all prevention and correctional offenders. Now, the pattern of crime to prison, to parole, to crime, and back to prison describes what has been commonly called the revolving door of criminal justice, a loop involving all three components of the justice system. And if past statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics hold true, more than 2/3 of those released from prison will be arrested for new offenses within 3 years, and more than 50% will return to or for committing new crimes or violating conditions of their supervision. And such statistics simply confirm what police officers already know from experience. The same people, a lot of times, are being arrested over and over and over again. And this return to criminal activity after being caught, convicted, and corrected, if you will, is called recidivism, the repeated or habitual offending, which is really tough for us to get used to kind of in law enforcement. So what can we kind of do to deal with some of these things? And I want to skip ahead to make sure that I have a couple of different things in here. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of come back. So I apologize for that, but I want to make sure I cover all of these areas. Now, reentry programs, this is actually one thing that we can do. And you saw the video that I showed you on the Rialto Police Department's reentry program. And law enforcement officers' arrest decisions, and I've said this I think in the last chapter, directly affect those who may end up in corrections. And officers are also key partners in reentry efforts, including pretrial supervision and probation and parole. And I think you saw that when you watched that video. And I don't know about you, but that video made you feel good that people actually took you up on the services, like that one gentleman who became a firefighter, for goodness sake, and he had some issues. So that's just kind of gets you a little bit excited when you look at stuff. Now this video right here, while there's a lot of humor in this particular video, it does talk about some very specific issues related to reentry programs. So when you watch it, understand it's from a late night program, John Oliver. There might be a little profanity in there. And so I'm going to warn you ahead of time, but I'm also going to tell you that there is some good information that this gentleman brings forward relating to re-entry programs. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out. So corrections, if we're going to kind of define it, I guess, refers to the programs and services and agencies and institutions responsible for supervising individuals charged with or convicted of crimes. And the primary goal of corrections would be to protect society. Now, we know there's a lot of primary purposes of corrections because we went over those 4, but the primary goal is to protect society. And this is a link to a video where there is an individual who has been in the system, talks about corrections and rehabilitation, and it's a good video as well. So a couple of terms that we need to know, and some of these are going to be a quick review as we move forward through the chapter. Deterrence sees convictions as a way to prevent future criminal actions, tries to show the offenders that the price of committing a crime is too great. Specific deterrence aimed at specific offenders and attempts to make the consequences of committing the crime so severe that when the offenders get out and return to society, maybe they won't do it. And general deterrence serves as an example to others as the consequences of crime. Now kind of think of this though. Murder is illegal, right? And the penalty can be up to and including death, but yet we still have it. So when you think about deterrence, you have to put everything into context, and some people don't think that, some of these penalties actually deter people. And when we look at a couple of different theories on crime or theories on corrections, you'll start to see kind of what I'm talking about. So what are like conflicting views when we talk about corrections? Well, for centuries, the clash between the classical and the positivist view of criminality have resulted in a very fervent debate centered on who or what is responsible for crime and how society should deal with those people who break the law. And this is going to be an interesting conversation, and some of you are probably going to nut up on this conversation basically, and some will kind of go with it, but let's see how it goes. So there are these conflicting views on crime, and when you look on page 574, you'll see a comparison of a couple of different models as it relates to crime. But let's look at the 2 conflicting views for a minute. So the classical view, which focuses on crime, holds that humans have free will and they are responsible for their own actions. Now, I usually don't pick sides here, but I'm going with this one to a certain extent, okay? And the positivist view, which focuses on the criminal, holds that humans are the product of environmental and maybe even cultural influences. So that's kind of interesting. And the positivist view, by focusing on the criminal, helped advanced experimental methods of research in the field of criminology. Now, most people do not believe exclusively in one view or another, and perhaps we'll have time to go back and go into these views a little bit more. Or some see it kind of as a combination, but most also, however, tend to place greater credence in one view than another, and this directly influences how they view crime and criminals, as well as what they consider to be the primary purpose of corrections. So let me say that again so you get it. We know what the classical view is, and we know what the positive view is. Now, most people, again, they do not believe exclusively in one view or the other, but see some combination of free will and determinism governing human behavior. And most also, however, tend to place greater credence in one view than the other, and this directly influences how they view crime and criminals, as well as what they consider to be the primary purpose for corrections. Not for crime, but for corrections. Now these differing views have resulted in two distinct models, and now we're talking about the view of corrections. Back here was the view on crime and the criminal, if you will. Here are the ideologies and models as it relates to correction. So a little bit of a difference here, okay? So stay with me. Again, I know it's kind of difficult to kind of keep track in your mind. Now, the medical model assumes that offenders are victims of society and their environment who need to be cured. And the justice model assumes offenders are self-directed, acting on free will, and responsible for their crimes. And although the table on page 574 includes only portions of the 20th and 21st centuries, societies throughout the ages have vacillated basically from one model to the other, with intermediate models in between, again, as reflected in the correctional ideologies that parallel them. So it seems kind of complex, but if you look at 574, you'll see the issue on the left, the medical model in the middle, and the justice model on the right, and you can look at how they kind of are different, how they compare and contrast, if you will. And it might be a good idea to take a look at that. So again, correctional ideologies and models, and how does this play into what we're talking about? Well, the complexity of corrections is evident in the interrelatedness of correctional ideologies. And understanding these ideologies is important to understand the current state of corrections and the problems and issues facing it, because these ideas are historically conditioned and change partly because of matters unrelated to criminal justice policy or practice. And a specific purpose or philosophy of punishment becomes more or less attractive to society as it considers these complex set of ideas. Thus, the basic rhetorical strategies of one era differ from those of another. So penitentiaries give way to reformatories, and big houses or prisons give way to correctional institutions. And most of the ideologies applied to correctional actions over the years fall into one of four categories, and like punishment and control and treatment and prevention. And these ideologies may overlap. For example, some forms of punishment might also be perceived as methods of control. So we'll take a look at these four: punishment and the justice model. And a model kind of goes with these. So stay with me as we look. Punishment and the justice model. This fundamental principle underlying the justice model is that society has a duty to punish those who break the law, which I can kind of agree with. Control and the custodial model. The focus in on the present and on the immediate need to restrain the behavior of those convicted of crimes. Treatment and the medical model views offenders as capable of rehabilitation. Do you think everybody can be rehabilitated? That's a super interesting question, and maybe we'll get to that. And prevention ideology and the reintegration model considers both the offender and the offender's environment. So a lot of different strategies and ideologies and philosophies and all the E's that kind of come in there. So I know it's confusing, which again is kind of why you want to go through that textbook a little bit and really get a good handle on what we're talking about as far as all the different models and philosophies. So let's talk a little bit about numbers and really kind of see where we're going here. And I want to skip ahead to see if I get to, okay, so I'm going to get to it in a minute, but we're going to talk about numbers. Now, Americans deserve criminal justice policies that keep them safe, and they want serious, violent, and chronic criminals put in prison. And in 2007, the number of adults under some type of correctional supervision reached an all-time high at 2.3 million behind bars and another 5 million on probation or parole, and that's a lot of people. And the American criminal justice system holds more than 2.3 million people in 1,719 state prisons, 102 federal prisons, 901 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,163 local jails, and 76 Indian country jails, as well as in military prison, immigration detention facilities, civil commitment centers, and prisons in the U.S. territories. And this link will take you to a website called Prison Policy that has a lot of good information if you want numbers. But you can look at this chart or diagram, if you will, and it shows how many people are locked up within the United States and where they are. And even like what the highest lockup rate might be. And you can look here. So we've got drugs here and property crimes here and public order crimes here. And it'll tell you what they are kind of on the outside of the circle, which makes it very easy. And violent crimes here. So here's your state prison. Here's your federal prison. Here's your local jails. And then you can look at some other areas as we look over here. And this is a lot of people, folks. So the United States locks up more people per capita than any other nation. So just, food for thought as we talk a little bit more. So how do we not lock up so many people? Well, we can look for what they call a window of opportunity, and we find that sometimes in these pretrial service areas or pretrial. So pretrial services, no matter how brief the detention, provide that window of opportunity. From the moment an offender is arrested and charged with a crime, offender assessment should begin to determine what level of supervision and services are required. And although reentry usually refers to inmates being released from prison, it also can apply to the millions of offenders who leave the nation's jails each year before their trials. Offering treatment services or other diversion avenues to an offender at this pre-trial stage can help to interrupt that cycle of criminal behavior and create kind of a platform to minimize the collateral consequence of an arrest. And such collateral consequences include being removed from family and perhaps losing a job. And in our criminal justice system, those charged with a crime are presumed to be innocent until found guilty. And in most instances, they also have the right to bail to ensure their appearance in court. And we talked about the benefits of diversion, remember? It was either last chapter or the chapter before. So there are some benefits, including this window of opportunity, along with some other alternatives to incarceration. So it starts with offender assessment to deal or to determine the level of supervision. And because the number of offenders cycling through it, it provides a lot of opportunity for things like community supervision or diversion and treatment. And these are all cost-effective and deemed suitable alternatives to incarceration. And sometimes they call them intermediate sanctions. And I'll define that for you. An often more cost-effective and suitable alternative to incarceration can be found among many intermediate sanctions. And these are also called like community corrections, or what we call, like I was talking before, we go back to the slide here, diversion and treatment. These are intermediate sanctions that are tougher than traditional probation, but less stringent and less expensive than, say, prison. So what are some alternatives to incarceration then? And these are listed starting in 578 in your book, and I think they go all the way through 579, and I'm going to briefly touch on them, I think, if I have time. So Americans, again, deserve criminal justice policies to keep them safe, and they want these serious, violent people put in prison. And at the same time, a majority of Americans support cost-effective strategies for dealing with offenders who pose kind of a less risk to the community. And a fundamental driver of correctional cost is the number of people that are housed in our nation's jails and prisons. Now, this kind of fluctuates depending upon what document you look at. But the yearly cost to incarcerate someone, a federal inmate, not state, but federal, was about $31,000, or about $84 per day. And again, the United States has 5% of the world's population, but about 25% of the world's prisoners. So that's just kind of scary, I guess. So what are these alternatives to incarceration? These less restrictive and less costly than punishment in state prison? Well, it could include things like day fines or straight fines, and day fines differ from straight fines in that they are based on an offender's daily income and ability to pay. A straight fine is just a fine. The day fine would be based on your ability to pay. So that kind of makes sense. What about forfeiture or restitution? And these are a couple of other things that are out there. Community service, intensive supervision, which would be something like intensive supervised probation, and it involves more supervision and greater restrictions than the standard, say, probation does. Or house arrest or electronic monitoring, and that's also referred to as home confinement or home detention. That requires offenders to remain at their homes during specified times and to adhere to a curfew. Day reporting centers, where these are non-residential facilities where offenders must appear daily. Residential community corrections for offenders whom live-in sanctions are more appropriate. Residential community corrections are available. An alternative, just a step away from incarceration, if you will. And then probation, the oldest community-based correctional program and the most common alternative to jail or a prison sentence. And probation provides a foundation on which to build a wide range of community-based services. And we'll talk, I believe, more about probation right now. So this is the most common alternative. And a gentleman by the name of John Augustus was considered to be the father of probation. And probation is basically a conditional suspension of a sentence of a person convicted of a crime but not yet in prison for that crime. So does that kind of make sense? A conditional suspension of a sentence of a person convicted of a crime, but not yet in prison for that crime. And the defendant is placed under the supervision of a probation officer for a set period of time, and also must meet specific criteria or conditions. And these conditions of probation can vary, and it depends on the nature of the offense and the court goals. And the purpose of probation is to help offenders maintain law-abiding behavior through supervision. And who gets probation? Well, it's typically the court considers the kind of the lower level crime. It's most often used with first-time offenders, property offenders, low-risk offenders, and non-violent offenders, but not always, just so you know. But for the textbook purpose, it is most often used for those first-time offenders and property offenders and the list of people that I kind of told you. Now, probation and punishment, it's not quick, and it's certainly not certain. And there is a growing use of probation. So if you look at year end in 2011, an estimated 3,971,300 adults in the U.S. were serving probationary sentences. And a more recent report released by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 4,708,100 adults live under community supervision as of December 31st, 2014. And that figure represents about what? 1 in 52 adults in the United States. So that's a lot. Well, what about, when we talk about incarceration? So we've talked about some alternatives, and now we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about incarceration and what happens when you get out and things like that. So for violent offenders and those whose crimes are particularly severe or habitual, community corrections and these other intermediate things would not be appropriate alternatives. So for these offenders, incarceration is more of a likely sentence. And many types of correctional facilities exist for incarceration or confining of offenders. So incarceration basically means being confined in a jail or prison. And the primary goal of these facilities, again, are to protect society. Well, what's the difference? And we've kind of talked about these things, prisons and jails and, lockups. Oh my, or that's the Wizard of Oz. But anyway, so what's a jail then? We kind of know what a prison is, right? Those are the higher rated type correctional facilities, usually for felons that have been convicted, not just maybe one time, but multiple times. And the level of security is quite a bit higher, and things are more intense. And we'll kind of look at prisons in just a minute. But a jail is a place of confinement where detained individuals are waiting to appear before court. And you hold those sentenced to a year or less as far as incarceration goes. So jails are an important part of the criminal justice system, and they go by a variety of names, and houses of detention and houses of correction, but their definitions are generally the same. A jail is a place of confinement typically administered by local law enforcement, although occasionally by a regional or state law enforcement agencies. And jails serve that dual function that I just talked about. Now, lockups are commonly located like at the police station or sometimes city halls, but primarily at your police department. It's a temporary holding facility that usually is for a max of, let's say, 48 hours. And for lockups and jails, we're looking at 744,600 people in these jails at the end of 2014. So prisons are at the top, the most secure of the correctional facilities. Jails are intermediate, usually for crimes that the punishment is basically less than a year. And that could be like West Valley Detention Center. That's a jail. Prisons could be like Chino State Prison or something like that. And then lockups are the smallest, or typically located in city halls, but usually in police stations. So that should give you the difference on that. So a jail, this is a photo of the West Valley Detention Center in San Bernardino County, and this is a jail. And prisons are what people think of when they think of corrections, though. We kind of said that at the onset of this lecture, and they are administered by a warden or a superintendent. And they hold convicted offenders sentenced to more than 1 year, typically felonies with more than 1 year of incarceration. And these prisons may be punitive or treatment oriented. And the critical overcrowding issue, as well as the inward flow of contraband, assaults, rapes, and what they call prisonization and privatization. So there's a lot of issues as we look at the issues surrounding prisons. So again, they may be punitive or treatment orientated. And punitive oriented prisons are more formal and rigid, with emphasis on obedience. And obedience is sought more through negative incentives. And treatment oriented prisons are more informal and flexible, with some positive incentives, let's say for good behavior and things like that. So one of the issues that we've been dealing with, and we won't spend a lot of time here, was the advent of Assembly Bill 109 in California, which was the early release of certain prisons because of prisoner overcrowding. And I'll let you click on the link and you can kind of look through that, but I wanted to make sure you knew about that. Now, this would be more of a prison as compared to the jail that you saw before. So hopefully that kind of adds a little credence to it. Now, what's the most frequent type of release? Well, the most frequent type of release would be parole. Now, as we back up, and I'm not gonna back up on the slides because I think it would take me too long to get there. But remember, we talked about probation, right? And do you remember what probation was? Not its definition, okay? But what was the other term there? It was alternative. So remember, probation is the oldest community-based correctional program and the most common alternative to jail, which means that you're not going to prison because you're going to get probation. Now we're talking about parole, which is the most frequent type of release. So parole is the conditional release from prison before the expiration of the sentence and the period of supervision in the community following that same release. And it is the most frequent type of release from a correctional facility. And at year end in 2014, nearly 856,900 adults were on parole. So parole differs from probation in that a person who is paroled has spent some time serving their prison sentence. Does that kind of hopefully help clear that up? Well, who gets parole? Well, it kind of depends. Factors influencing whether a person is serving a sentence is eligible for, indeed, is granted parole include the type of offense, the offender's prior record, state statutes that are there, and the inmate's behavior while incarcerated, participation in certain programs, whether or not the inmate has a plan for life outside of prison, and if the inmate poses any public risk. A lot of those things are kind of considered. And conditions of parole, just like probation, there's going to be certain probation conditions. There's going to be parole conditions like going to regular meetings or getting a job or promising to act lawfully and stay in your residence or drug testing and different things like that. And then there's the pros and cons of parole. And parole has many advocates and critics over the years, and proponents assert that parole plays an important role in relieving the pressures of our overcrowded prisons. But opponents claim that parole lets offenders off by shortening their stay behind bars and exposes the public to criminals who really haven't paid their debt to society, or those that still might, let's say, pose a threat to society. So we talked about reentry a little bit. And here's some elements of successful reentry programs. And reentry is a statewide issue. And the current approach is costly. But the outcomes, like you saw in the video, can really be good. And the solutions for this prison issue are not entirely within corrections. And both human services and law enforcement have to be a part of the solution. And communication and data sharing are really essential to success. And here, honestly, with reentry and reintegration, you can measure success. So you can have a program and you can actually track and measure the success of this program. So those are some of the elements of successful reentry programs. So what about, and we're going to kind of finish up with a very controversial thing, and I think we're going to talk about juveniles and then we'll be done. Well, in 2015, states executed a total of 28 prisoners and handed down 49 death sentences. And when you talk about the death penalty, it's a lot of controversy, and not all offenders will return to society because the general population and the courts agree that offenders who have committed really heinous crimes and violent crimes should never be allowed to walk freely again. So the question becomes a matter of life versus death. Should we keep these offenders locked up forever or life, or execute them death? And we don't have enough time to debate it. It may have been a discussion question as far on a discussion board for the death penalty. And this is where you could maybe read a little bit more and give me some of your thoughts on that. Now, supporters, see it as retribution, and opponents see it as morally reprehensible, and self-defeating, and it's costly and it's cruel, and all the other things like that. And at one time, there have been a couple of cases that basically put the death penalty on hold in California, if you will. But this article on November 12th, 2015, shows that a federal appeals court on Thursday overturned a federal judge's ruling that found that the state's death penalty system was unconstitutional. So in a unanimous decision, a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the argument basically on a technicality that it did not address the question of whether life on death row in California constituted cruel and unusual punishment. And lawyers who argued on both sides of this case said the appellate ruling was decided largely on technical grounds and leaves unanswered basically larger questions on whether these lengthy delays are unconstitutional. And what it really means, and the issue is that they had people on death row, and it wasn't necessarily the constitutionality of death versus life or the death penalty, but the fact that somebody would have to stay on death row for 25 years before the execution actually would take place. And those were some of the issues. So read more on that, and then you can put some of your cool thoughts on the discussion board. So finishing up with juveniles, because remember there's that fourth piece that we talked about that's in there. So there are 100,000 juveniles residing in detention centers each day. And about 50 or 80% of youth released from juvenile facilities are rearrested within within 3 years. And just like in adult, corrections, we have intermediate sanctions for juveniles, like shelters and ranches and farms and group homes and halfway houses, and even residential placements like boot camps. And we even have parole, which is a different name for juveniles. It's called aftercare. So in juvenile corrections, the focus on reentry into the community, which should be a focus throughout a juvenile's involvement in the system, usually the weakest component of the system, but we call juvenile parole basically aftercare. So, and this focuses on that reentry into the community. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over juvenile corrections, but I wanted you to know one thing. Perhaps one of the most crucial areas of juvenile justice is correctly assessing where to place juveniles who are brought into the system. And a mounting body of evidence has shown that incorrect assessment and placement of a youthful offender can actually worsen his or her antisocial behavior and decrease the chances of successful rehabilitation. Thus, many jurisdictions are critically reevaluating how and where they place juveniles among the variety of correctional alternatives that are available. And correctional alternatives for juveniles also include things like probation, immediate sanctions, incarceration, and in some states, the death penalty, although probation is by far the most frequent disposition in juvenile delinquency cases. And the primary focus of juvenile corrections has traditionally been and continues to be what we call rehabilitation. So with that being said, that's going to be the end of our chapter 14 lecture. And take the time to, again, look at those key terms and look at the discussion questions and think about the death penalty. Not that it's cool, but you can add some vibrant conversation on the discussion board about your opinion as it relates to the death penalty and correction. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them on the discussion board. Or if you don't want to do that, you can email me. And that'll be it again for chapter 14. So until